A racist police officer is patrolling a wealthy neighborhood when he spots a black man walking down the street. Without cause, the officer assumes a man must be trouble and arrests him. What he doesn't realize is that the man he's apprehended is none other than General Michael James, a high-ranking officer in the United States Army. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful human stories. Michael James, tall and athletic, strolled along the tree-lined streets, his footsteps barely audible on the pavement. His casual appearance masked an undeniable air of authority. Something in his posture, the way he carried himself, spoke volumes. Though few knew it, Michael had often visited this neighborhood. He owned a house just a few blocks away, a quiet retreat he had purchased years ago to escape the pressures of his demanding career. Today, he had decided to take a walk, as he often did, basking in the warmth of the late afternoon sun and the peacefulness of surroundings. As the sun sank lower, casting longer shadows, Michael remained unaware of the shocking event that was about to disrupt this tranquil moment. As Michael walked, the quiet of the neighborhood wrapped around him like a blanket. The soft rustling of the leaves in the trees above, the chirping of distant birds. These were the things that brought him peace. His mind wandered, briefly considering the upcoming briefing at the Pentagon, then shifting the thoughts of his family and the rare moments of freedom he enjoyed away from the military's grip. But just as he approached the corner of Birchwood and 14th Street, something shifted. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of a vehicle slowing down. Michael didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone was turning, or maybe it was just a fellow resident heading back to their home. However, the car continued to roll alongside him. Michael's instincts kicked in, his military training alerting him to the oddity of the situation. The car had come to a slow crawl, almost as if it was deliberately keeping pace with him. Michael's first thought was that it might be someone lost, trying to find an address. But when he glanced over, he saw the flashing blue and red lights from the patrol car's roof. The car came to a stop, and the driver's side window rolled down. A man in uniform leaned out, his gaze locked on Michael. "Hey, you," the officer called out, his voice sharp and demanding. Michael stopped in his tracks, raising an eyebrow. He was accustomed to interactions like this, though rarely under circumstances like these. His calm expression betrayed nothing, but inside, his military mind was already running through the options, mentally calculating the next steps. "Can I help you, officer?" Michael asked, his voice even, betraying none of the annoyance that had started to build in him. The officer, Officer Thomas Grant, a middle-aged, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a scowl that could freeze water, looked Michael over with an air of superiority. He didn't respond immediately, instead taking a moment to size up Michael, eyes scanning from the polished shoes up to his face. "You're walking a little too calmly for someone in this neighborhood," Officer Grant finally said, his words dripping with judgment. "What's your business around here? Don't you have your own area to be in?" Michael's posture remained unaffected, his arms by his sides, his expression neutral. "I live nearby. Just taking a walk," he said simply, keeping his voice controlled. Grant didn't seem to like the answer. "Well, you don't look like you belong here," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Michael to hear. Michael stood there for a moment, considering his response. He had encountered prejudice before, especially as a black man in a predominantly white, affluent area, but this felt different, more pointed, more personal. He chose not to engage in a battle of words, just yet, holding his ground. "I don't see how that matters, officer," he said calmly. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Grant's lips twisted into a sneer, and Michael could feel the officer's gaze hardening. "No one's asking you to explain yourself," Grant barked. "Just hand me your ID." Michael blinked, his patience starting to wear thin. "I don't need to show you anything," he said, his voice steady but now carrying a slight edge. Grant's jaw clenched, and he stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with an authority that Michael couldn't ignore. The officer's movements were deliberate, calculated. "You think you're above the law? Just because you're in a fancy suit?" "Let me make this clear," Grant said, stepping toward Michael, his hand instinctively resting on the baton at his side. "I don't need a reason to check who you are. You look suspicious, and that's enough." Michael's brows furrowed at the officer's sudden aggression. His military training urged him to assess the situation, keep it calm, but also be prepared for anything. "I'm not breaking any laws," Michael said, his voice quieter now, laced with frustration but maintaining control. "I don't have to justify my presence." Grant's eyes hardened, and without warning, he took a step forward, placing a firm hand on Michael's shoulder. "I said, show me your ID," Grant repeated, this time with more force. Michael immediately stiffened, his internal warning system flashing red. His instinct told him to step back, to avoid physical confrontation. He couldn't risk making a scene, especially not here, not like this. Yet something in Grant's posture, the sheer audacity of this officer, set Michael's mind on alert. "I'm not showing you anything," Michael said sharply, trying to pull away from Grant's grip. But Grant was persistent, his grip tightening as he pulled Michael closer. "You're going to show me your ID or I'll take you in. You understand?" The officer's aggression escalated in an instant. It was no longer a simple question. It was a demand, one Michael couldn't ignore. He could feel the air between them grow thick with tension. The grip on Michael's shoulder tightened as Officer Grant pushed him forward. For a brief moment, Michael considered resisting. His military training had conditioned him for far worse situations, but he knew this was different. He needed to remain composed. He couldn't afford to escalate things, not in public, not with a crowd beginning to gather. The officer's grip was firm, almost aggressive, and his eyes now gleamed with the certainty that he was in control of the situation. "Listen, you don't want to do this," Michael said, his voice low but filled with quiet authority. Grant ignored him, stepping even closer. The crowd that had gathered seemed unsure of what to make of the situation, some whispering, others recording with their phones. Michael could hear their hushed voices, their murmurs of confusion, but he focused on the officer in front of him. "You really think you can just walk around here without consequences? People like you," Grant's words trailed off, but the insinuation was clear. "People like you need to learn their place." Michael's patience thinned. He was being accused of something he hadn't done, just because of his appearance. His mind raced, and a feeling of cold anger began to rise within him. But he didn't let it show on his face. He knew that if he allowed himself to lose control, it would only give Grant more reason to act out. But the more the officer spoke, the more Michael's resolve hardened. "I am not the one causing a problem here," Michael said firmly, raising his voice slightly for everyone to hear. "But you're about to make one. I am a United States Army officer, a lieutenant general. You are making a massive mistake." Grant paused for a moment, clearly not processing the gravity of what Michael had just said. He looked Michael up and down with disdain, clearly not believing him. "Yeah, right. And I'm the president. I don't care who you are. You're under arrest for resisting an officer." Michael could feel his chest tighten with frustration, the familiar weight of systemic prejudice bearing down on him. This wasn't about who he was or what he had done. It was about the assumptions Grant had made based on the color of his skin and the clothes he wore. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong," Michael said, taking a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "Let me go. Now." But Grant was already reaching for his handcuffs. The sound of the metal scraping against the fabric of his uniform felt like it echoed in Michael's ears. He tried once more to stay calm, to defuse the situation, but the officer wasn't listening. As Grant snapped the cuffs onto Michael's wrists, the crowd around him began to murmur more audibly. Phones were raised higher now, recording every moment. Some people tried to intervene, asking what was going on, others unsure of the situation, but no one was brave enough to challenge the officer directly. Grant, satisfied that he had gained control, shoved Michael toward the squad car. Michael stumbled slightly but caught himself, the cuffs tight around his wrists. His mind raced, not only with the unfairness of it all, but also with the realization that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. He knew the system well enough to understand how quickly things could spiral out of control. Michael was shoved into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his mind. The car's interior smelled faintly of leather and cleaning supplies, the silence punctuated only by the occasional hum of the engine as Officer Grant drove with an angry determination. As the car rumbled through the streets, Michael leaned back, his posture still stiff but his thoughts clear. The injustice of what was happening didn't surprise him. He had seen it before, both in the military and in civilian life. But this time it was different. It was personal. He was a man used to power, used to control. But this situation, the complete disregard for his rights, felt like a violation of everything he had worked for. The drive to precinct felt longer than it actually was, the distance between them growing more unbearable with each passing second. When they arrived, Officer Grant yanked the door open, his grip tight on Michael's arm, pulling him out of the car with more force than necessary. "On your feet," Grant barked, as if Michael had any intention of resisting. Michael stood tall, his feet planted firmly on the ground, and his head held high, despite the handcuffs. His heart was calm, but his mind was already working on the next steps. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that as soon as his identity was revealed, the game would change. Inside the precinct, things were tense, but in a different way. Officers moved with practiced speed and efficiency, some glancing at Michael with uncertainty, others acting as if everything was routine. None of them knew who he was. At least, not yet. Officer Grant pushed him through the corridors with a grim look on his face, clearly enjoying the power he felt in this moment. They stopped in an interrogation room, and Grant opened the door with a flourish, shoving Michael inside. "Sit down," Grant ordered, his voice dripping with arrogance. Michael took a seat, but he didn't flinch. He refused to show any weakness. He sat straight, his eyes focused and unwavering, as he assessed the situation. "Let's get this over with," Grant muttered, tossing a file onto the table in front of Michael. "I'm not going to let you walk out of here until I'm done with you." Michael didn't respond. He had learned long ago that words would never change someone like Grant's mindset, so he sat there quietly, observing the man who had arrested him, trying to read the situation. It wasn't long before Sergeant Carla Jennings walked into the room. She was a woman in her late 30s with short, dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She wasn't as imposing as Officer Grant, but there was an undeniable strength in the way she carried herself. "Officer Grant, can I speak with you outside?" she asked, her tone measured but firm. Grant didn't protest. He simply nodded and walked out of the room, leaving Michael alone with Sergeant Jennings. Jennings closed the door behind her and took a seat across from Michael. She studied him carefully for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together the situation. "I need to apologize," she said, her voice soft but tinged with regret. "This should never have happened." Michael looked at her, the words almost tasting bitter on his tongue. "I've been arrested for no reason," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "I've been treated like a criminal, and I haven't done anything wrong. If you want to apologize, that's fine, but I need to be released. Now." Jennings nodded slowly, her face filled with genuine remorse. "You're right. You should have been treated with respect. What happened here shouldn't have happened. But it did," Michael said, his tone colder now. "And it's not just about me. It's about the bigger problem, the way people like me are treated based on assumptions and stereotypes. It's a system issue, not just an officer issue." Jennings sighed, her gaze dropping to the table for a brief moment. "I know. I've been trying to get the department to take racial bias seriously for a long time, but I can't make changes on my own." Michael leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then it's time for someone to make the change," he said, his voice filled with quiet authority. "You can start with me." Before Jennings could respond, the door to the interrogation room opened and Officer Grant returned. He looked at the two of them, confusion and frustration written across his face. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "I'm going to call for your suspension," Sergeant Jennings said firmly. "You've made a mistake, and you'll be held accountable for it." Grant's face turned red with anger, and his fists clenched at his sides. "What are you talking about? I've done nothing wrong. This guy is trouble." "I think it's time you learned who you're dealing with," Michael said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I'm Lieutenant General Michael James, and you just arrested me without cause, based on nothing but your assumptions. You've made a huge mistake, and I'm going to make sure the department hears about it." Grant's eyes widened as the weight of Michael's words sank in. He opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. He looked back at Jennings, his expression now one of shock and disbelief. "You're joking," Grant muttered, clearly unable to process what he'd just heard. "I'm not joking," Michael replied, his gaze unwavering. "And you're going to regret this. You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." The tension in the room hung thick as Officer Grant stood there, staring at Michael, unable to process what had just been revealed. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Sergeant Jennings, who had been standing by silently, finally broke the silence. "You heard him, Grant," she said sharply. "This man is a lieutenant general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Army. You've just made a monumental mistake, and now it's time to face the consequences." Grant's face turned crimson as he stumbled backward, his mind racing. "I didn't know," he stammered. I thought he was just another what, Grant?" Sergeant Jennings interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses like a knife. "Another black man walking down the street? You didn't even bother to check before making an arrest. You didn't stop to think about who he might be. You saw his skin and you assumed. That's the problem. And it's not going to go away with your apology." Grant's jaw clenched, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. For the first time, he seemed to be grasping the gravity of his actions, but it was too little, too late. Michael, who had been silent for a moment, spoke again, his voice calm but filled with undeniable authority. "I'm not just angry because you made a mistake. I'm angry because this happens every single day to people like me, people who don't have the platform or the power to fight back. What happened to me is not unique. It's a reality for too many." The words seemed to hang in the air, and for the first time, Officer Grant looked as though he might truly comprehend what he had done. His posture sagged, his earlier confidence replaced by something akin to shame. "I'm sorry," he muttered, but it was barely audible. Michael stood up, his movement slow but deliberate. He turned to face Sergeant Jennings, his eyes unwavering. "I don't want an apology. I want accountability. I want to see change, not just words. And it starts with you making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Jennings nodded solemnly, her expression now one of determination. "You have my word. This will be investigated, and there will be consequences. You'll have justice." As Michael was escorted from the interrogation room, his mind raced. He wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but he knew one thing for certain. His fight wasn't just about him. It was about making sure no one else would have to endure what he had just been put through. His career, his rank, his position, none of it mattered when it came to fighting for justice. If he had to stand up and be counted, he would. Outside the precinct, the news of Michael's wrongful arrest spread quickly. The media had already begun to pick up the story, thanks to the bystanders who had recorded the incident and shared it across social platforms. The video was now going viral. A black man in an expensive suit, clearly educated, clearly powerful, arrested for no reason other than the officer's prejudice. The news outlets were quick to report the identity of the man arrested. It wasn't long before the general public was made aware of who Michael James truly was. The story ignited a firestorm of debate about racial profiling, police brutality, and the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement. The following days were a whirlwind for Lieutenant General Michael James. His name was plastered across the headlines of every major news outlet, his face broadcasted on television screens, and splashed across social media platforms. The video of his arrest was everywhere. People watched in disbelief as a black man in a tailored suit, a high-ranking officer in the military, was treated like a criminal without cause. The story quickly became more than just a local incident. It became a national conversation. The hashtag Justice for General James trended on Twitter, and the public response was immediate. Calls for accountability were coming from all corners, activists, politicians, military officials, and ordinary citizens alike. People who had experienced similar injustices came forward, sharing their own stories of racial profiling and discrimination at the hands of law enforcement. But for Michael, it wasn't about the headlines or the online support. It was about what happened next, the system of accountability that needed to follow. He had been prepared for the media attention. He had been prepared for the backlash against a police officer who had wrongfully arrested him. But what he hadn't anticipated was how the entire incident would force people to confront their own biases and assumptions about race and power. As the outrage continued to grow, Sergeant Rachel Jennings took the first step toward accountability. She publicly addressed the issue in a press conference, condemning Officer Grant's actions and calling for a full internal investigation into the matter. She was careful to frame her comments not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger, systemic issue within the police department, a culture of unchecked bias that had been allowed to fester for far too long. I have known Officer Grant for years, but what happened to Lieutenant General Michael James is inexcusable, Sergeant Jennings said, her voice calm but firm. This was not just a mistake. It was a failure of the system. We are committed to addressing this issue head-on, and we will hold the responsible parties accountable. The investigation into Officer Grant's actions began immediately, but Michael wasn't interested in seeing him merely reprimanded. He knew that a slap on the wrist wouldn't change the culture. What he wanted, what he demanded, was a full reckoning, not just for Officer Grant, but for the entire department. He wasn't about to let this incident be swept under the rug. Behind the scenes, Michael's lawyers were working tirelessly to ensure that his name would be cleared of any wrongdoing. The evidence was clear. There was no reason for his arrest, and Officer Grant's actions were not only unjust but unlawful. But Michael wasn't just fighting for himself. He wanted to use this moment to demand change, not just for him, but for anyone who had been wronged by the system in this way. That's when the Department of Justice stepped in. The national outrage had forced their hand, and Attorney General Leah Grant, no relation to the officer, announced a federal investigation into the police department's practices. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about the larger patterns of racial discrimination and abuse that had taken root within law enforcement agencies across the country. In an emotional address, Attorney General Grant stated, "What happened to General James is part of a broader issue of racial bias in policing. It's not enough to reprimand officers after the fact. We need comprehensive reform that addresses these issues at their core. This will not be ignored." Michael couldn't help but feel a surge of hope as he watched the press conference. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start, a serious federal start. For the first time since the incident, he felt like maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. Meanwhile, Officer Grant's suspension turned into a firing. The internal investigation revealed not just his misconduct in Michael's case, but a troubling pattern of racial bias and inappropriate conduct toward other members of the community. The video footage, coupled with numerous complaints about Grant behavior, led to the conclusion that he was unfit to serve as a police officer. Grant's termination was met with mixed reactions. Some believed it was long overdue, while others, particularly within the police union, argued that he was being scapegoated for the failures of the system. But the most important thing was that justice was being served, and Michael was no longer the only one fighting this battle. A few weeks later, the city council held a special meeting, and the topic of police reform was at the top of the agenda. The council discussed the creation of a civilian review board that would independently monitor police conduct and investigate allegations of misconduct. They also introduced new training programs aimed at tackling racial bias within the department. Michael wasn't present at the meeting. He had been focused on his military obligations, but he was proud to see that his actions were pushing the conversation in the right direction. Change was happening, even if it was just the beginning. The wheels of justice continued to turn slowly, but they were turning nonetheless. The weeks following Officer Grant's firing were filled with a mixture of public hearings, private meetings, and a steady stream of media attention. Michael, though caught up in the demands of his military position, could see the momentum for change beginning to build. He had sparked something, and now it was a question of how far the ripple effect would reach. The Department of Justice's investigation into the entire police department was just the beginning. A series of community-led discussions were organized, focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and the residents they served. These discussions, which Michael attended whenever his schedule allowed, began to uncover deeper issues of mistrust and systemic bias within the department. But it wasn't just the police that was under scrutiny. Politicians, community leaders, and even military personnel began questioning their own roles in perpetuating racial inequality and discrimination. Michael had always known that systemic change was a long road, but he had never anticipated the flood of support he would receive, not just from his fellow service members, but from all walks of life. In one such community meeting, held in a church hall a few miles from the precinct, Michael found himself sitting across from Councilman Thomas Reyes, a local politician who had been an outspoken advocate for police reform since the video of his arrest had gone viral. General James, Councilman Reyes began, looking directly at Michael. You've done something no one else had the courage to do. You've shone a light on an issue that's been brushed under the rug for far too long. Now, it's our job to make sure the changes stick. Michael nodded, his expression serious. This isn't just about one officer or one department. It's about the entire system. It's about making sure that my kids and their kids don't have to go through what I did. It's about showing every black man, woman, and child that they don't have to be afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them. The room fell silent for a moment as the gravity of Michael's words sank in. This wasn't just a one-time confrontation for him. It was a mission, a lifelong fight. He wasn't going to rest until the system that allowed injustice to flourish was dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. Michael's status as a high-ranking military officer gave him a platform that few others could claim. His actions in the wake of his wrongful arrest brought attention, not only from civilian leaders, but from his peers within the military as well. He was invited to participate in multiple forums and discussions regarding military and law enforcement cooperation, and how both institutions could address racial inequality in their ranks. In one such discussion, hosted by a Pentagon task force on race relations within federal agencies, Michael addressed a room full of military officials and law enforcement leaders. His words were measured yet powerful, as he spoke from both his professional experience and his personal experiences with injustice. People in my position, officers, generals, or anyone else, have a responsibility to lead by example, he said. I don't care what uniform you wear. I care about whether or not you're doing what's right. The system is broken, and we have to fix it, not just for us, but for the future. We are not immune to the biases that run rampant in our society. If we want to create a culture of true equality, we need to start by recognizing our own flaws. The room was quiet as his words settled. The generals and officers in attendance understood the weight of what Michael was saying, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were ready to take action. While some positive changes began to take shape, the road ahead was still steep. Not everyone within the police department or the government was on board with the reforms. There were powerful forces resisting the notion that the system was flawed, that there was a need to change how things had always been done. Michael was well aware of the political battles that lay ahead. He had seen it before, the way people clung to their power, their privilege, and their way of doing things, unwilling to admit that their methods had caused harm. As a result, Proposition 127, a bill that would establish mandatory training on racial bias for all law enforcement officers, struggled to gain traction in the state legislature. The bill was blocked several times by conservative members of the state assembly, who argued that such training wasn't necessary and that it would cost taxpayers too much. Michael knew he had to do more than just speak about reform. He had to show people the damage this kind of thinking caused. He began to collaborate with activists, educators, and other members of the community to hold rallies, not just in support of the bill, but in support of the broader cause of racial equality. These rallies became a movement, each one growing in size and in passion. People showed up, black and white, young and old, from all walks of life, because they recognized that Michael's fight wasn't just his own, it was theirs too. On the day that Proposition 127 was finally brought back to the state legislature, it passed with narrow majority. The bill was signed into law shortly thereafter, making racial bias training a requirement for all police officers in the state. It was a victory, but not the end of the fight. For Michael, the victory was bittersweet. He had spent so much of his life working within institutions of power, but it had taken something deeply personal to push him to this point. He could no longer ignore the glaring injustices in the system, whether in the military or in law enforcement. He had faced them himself, but now he was using his voice to ensure that future generations didn't have to. One quiet evening, after a long day of meetings, Michael sat alone on the porch of his home, looking out over the city. His thoughts turned to the future, to his children, to the world he wanted them to grow up in, a world where they weren't judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. As he looked out the horizon, he found a sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. And no matter how long it took, he would keep pushing for justice, because he knew that it wasn't just a right, it was a responsibility. Weeks turned into months, and the momentum for reform continued to build, but the path ahead was never smooth. The victories Michael had achieved with Proposition 127, the federal investigation, and the public outcry were only the beginning. While the laws were changing, attitudes remained stubborn, entrenched by decades of tradition and ignorance. But for Michael, the fight for justice wasn't just about winning legal battles. It was about shifting the culture, about ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to fight the same fight he had. The rallies he had organized, the speeches he had given, the interviews he had participated in, all of it had built a platform that could no longer be ignored. His actions had sparked something much larger than an isolated incident of police brutality. It was a nationwide conversation about race, power, and the systemic inequalities that had existed for far too long. And Michael was leading that conversation. As the months wore on, he began traveling to other cities, participating in town hall meetings and conferences that focused on police reform, racial inequality, and social justice. Everywhere he went, people listened. They recognized him not just as a lieutenant general in the U.S. Army, but as a symbol of the change that was needed. In one such town hall, held in a modest community center in Chicago, Michael stood before a crowd of activists, educators, and local residents. The room was filled with people who had their own stories to tell, stories of wrongful arrests, racial profiling, and lost opportunities. "We're not here to just talk about what's wrong," Michael said, his voice resonating with quiet strength. "We're here to talk about how to fix it, how we, as a society, can make sure that the mistakes I've experienced don't happen to others, how we can ensure that my children and your children can walk down the street without fear, how we can create a world where we are all seen equally, not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character." The crowd erupted in applause, and for a moment, Michael allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had all achieved together. He had never expected to become the face of a movement. But as he stood there, surrounded by people who had come together for a common cause, he knew that this was only the beginning. As much as Michael believed in the progress that had been made, he was under no illusions. The systems of power that had been entrenched for generations weren't going to be dismantled overnight. Law enforcement agencies across the country were still grappling with racial biases, still holding on to outdated practices and attitudes. The Department of Justice's investigation into the police department where Officer Grant had worked was just the first domino to fall. More departments were under scrutiny and more investigations were underway, but the task of reforming them was monumental. Michael knew it would take time, but he was prepared for the long haul. He had received support from countless individuals who were fighting their own battles within their communities, and that gave him hope. Civilian review boards were now being established in cities across the country, giving communities more power to oversee police conduct. In many places, police departments had begun implementing diversity and sensitivity training, acknowledging that their officers needed to understand the communities they served, not just as officers of the law, but as human beings. But not all changes were met with enthusiasm. There were still groups resisting the push for reform. Some argued that the very foundation of law enforcement needed to remain untouched, and that any changes to the system would weaken its ability to protect society. The Blue Lives Matter movement became a vocal counterpoint to those advocating for racial justice and police reform. The opposition wasn't just loud. It was persistent, fueled by fear and an unwillingness to accept the uncomfortable truths that were now being revealed. Michael faced this resistance head-on, engaging in difficult conversations with people on all sides of the debate. He knew that true change couldn't be accomplished by simply silencing the opposition. It had to be about education, about building bridges, about making everyone understand that police reform wasn't an attack on law enforcement. It was an attempt to make the system more just for everyone. As more police officers were held accountable for misconduct, Michael found himself speaking not only to the general public, but directly to the police force itself. He was invited to give talks about leadership and accountability at police academies, where he encouraged new recruits to look beyond their uniforms and see the human beings they were sworn to protect. "You can carry a badge," he told them, "but the true measure of your character is how you use the power that badge gives you. You must serve and protect not just with force, but with understanding and compassion. One evening, sitting on his porch after another long day of meetings and media appearances, Michael looked out over the city he had fought so hard to protect. The lights below twinkled like stars, and for a moment, the city felt peaceful, almost unchanged from the way it had been before everything had started. But Michael knew better. He had seen the cracks in the system. He had felt the pressure of those cracks, and he had watched as they began to widen. He turned to look at his wife, Samantha, who had joined him on the porch. She had been with him through it all, the late nights, the endless phone calls, the interviews, and the speeches. She had supported him, even when the weight of the fight seemed unbearable. "I never imagined this would be my life," Michael said quietly, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "I never imagined I'd be the one to push for this kind of change." Samantha reached over and placed a hand on his. "You didn't ask for this, Michael, but you've become exactly the kind of leader we need. And your voice, our voice, will carry this fight forward." Michael smiled faintly, the fatigue in his body giving way to a quiet resolve. "This fight isn't just mine. It's all of ours. And it's a fight I intend to keep fighting until we see the change we deserve." As Michael continued to reflect on his journey, he realized that the fight for justice was far from over. But he also knew that, because of the voices of so many people standing with him, they had already begun to change the tide. His name might be the one in the headlines, but it was a collective effort of countless people, those who had spoken up, those who had marched, those who had demanded change, that had made it all possible. In the end, Michael James had not only become a symbol of justice, he had become the catalyst for a movement, one that would continue to evolve and grow long after his own battle had ended. This wasn't the end of his story, but rather the beginning of something bigger than any individual. The change they sought was not just possible, it was inevitable. And Michael, standing firm as always, knew that he would be there every step away, pushing for justice, pushing for equality, and pushing for the future they all deserved. Thank you for following along with this journey. Comment below wherever you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Together, we can create a world where justice is not just a concept, but reality for everyone.